Hello students, in the next 3 video lectures we're going to be talking about consumers, producers, and the efficiency of markets. So far we have established how the market forces of supply and demand interact to reach a equilibrium price and equilibrium quantities. But we haven't talked about whether these outcomes are desirable or not, and that's what we're going to be doing next. So for that we're going to define two important concepts, consumer surplus and producer surplus, and we will talk about how they are related to the demand curve and the supply curve respectively. When we do that, then we're going to ask the question, do markets produce a desirable allocation of resources? Or could the market outcome be improved or not? That's what we're going to be doing next. So this topic and this study that falls in the field of welfare economics. Welfare economics studies how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being. And what do we mean by allocation of resources? Well, how much of each good is produced, which producers produce it, and which consumers consume it. And it's too early to give answers to those questions, but we're going to learn some interesting facts about which producers produce it, which consumers consume it. To get the idea going, I'm going to present a movie clip. In this movie clip from a movie called Just Go With It, it's Jennifer Aniston and Adam Sandler. Adam Sandler wants to cut a deal with this cute little girl, and he wants her to pretend to be his daughter. He wants her to act as if it was his daughter to help him get back with his ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Aniston. I think that's what's going on. I haven't really watched the movie. So in the movie clip, what's going to happen is that the girl and Adam Sandler are going to sit down to negotiate an agreement.
I'm just saying, telling the truth is not in the cards right now. I thought you'd be excited to have an acting job.
If it's an acting job, we should get paid.
Yeah, you're gonna get paid in experience.
I want to actually get paid.
All right, what do you want?
$600 for the day, plus overtime if we go over 8 hours. I'll do my own hair and makeup, and I want you to pay for the 6-week intensive acting camp that my mom can't afford.
$50 for the day and a 2-week acting class at the YMCA nearest you.
$500 and a 4-week acting class.
$300 and a 3-week class.
Done.
I would have done it for $500.
I would have done it for the experience.
Clever girl. Now the point of the movie clip is to illustrate the economic well-being of market participants. So for any market transaction, there's going to be a buyer, seller, and they're gonna agree on some price that they're going to trade. So how do we measure the economic well-being? Well, for buyers, we think of the maximum willingness to pay for a good as a measurement of the value of the good for the consumer. So in other words, you tell me how much you're willing to pay for a good, and I will say that that is your value of the good. So in our example here in the movie clip, Adam Sandler said that he was willing to pay $500 for the girl to act as her daughter. So this was his willingness to pay. They ended up paying a price of $300. He ended up paying the girl $300 per day, but he was willing to pay more, $500. So that difference between the willingness to pay minus the price that the buyer actually pay, we say that's a gain to the buyer. And that gain to the buyer, we call it the consumer surplus. In the movie clip, Adam Sandler was willing to pay $500 to the girl plus some marginal thing, minus the price of $300, then in that case, the consumer surplus would be $200. So Adam Sandler was happy at the end of the agreement that he was actually paying less than what he was willing to pay. And that's a gain for him. That's a consumer surplus. From the seller perspective, we have something similar. We have to think about the minimum willingness to sell. So what is the minimum amount of money that a seller needs in order to sell a product? And of course, this willingness to sell will come from the cost of producing the good, including the opportunity cost. So for sellers, if we take the price minus the willingness to sell, that's going to be a gain to the seller. So in our example here, In the movie clip, the little girl was willing to sell at how much? At zero. She would have done it for free. But she reached an agreement of a price of $300. So the $300 minus the willingness to sell zero, that got her a gain of $300. She would have done it for free anyways. So that's the way that we measure the economic well-being for sellers. And we call that the producer surplus. Now, the individuals are going to trade at a price somewhere between the willingness to pay of the buyer and the willingness to sell of the seller, somewhere between, not necessarily the middle. And this agreement, it must be mutually beneficial trade, otherwise they would not agree to it. And most importantly, our measurement of economic well-being in economics is going to be what we call the total surplus. And the total surplus is the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So once we take those interaction, this transaction provides a gain to the buyers and a gain to the sellers. When we add up those gains, that gets us our measurement of economic well-being that we call total surplus. So how does this generalize to a market with many buyers? So each buyer is going to have a willingness to pay a maximum amount that the buyer will pay for the good. And this measurement is going to be the value that the buyer places on the good. So here's an example with 4 buyers. Of course, in the real world and in markets, we have many other buyers, but I'm going to use 4 so that we can keep track of the decisions of individuals. So we see that the different willingness to pay of these 4 individuals. So we see that Flea, he has the highest willingness to pay. So he's the person who will be willing to pay the most for, in this example, we're looking at, say, iPods. He's willing to pay $300. So this is the maximum amount. He would not be willing to pay $301 or $350. His maximum willingness to pay is $300. And Anthony is the person with the second highest willingness to pay. He's willing to pay as much as $250, not anything more. Okay, not 251 or 260, 250. Now suppose that the price of an iPod is $200. Who will buy an iPod and what is the quantity demanded in the market? So think about that for a moment, press the pause button, come up with an answer, write it down, and then come back to see the answer. All right, I'll trust that you hit the pause button and came back with an answer. So if the price of an iPod is $200, who will buy an iPod? Well, to come up with that answer, we must realize that an individual would demand a good if the willingness to pay is greater than or equal to the price. So if you're willing to pay more than the price, then you would demand the good. You would not buy the good, or you would not demand the good if your willingness to pay is lower than the price. So the price of $200, we observe here that Anthony and Flea will buy an iPod, right? So at $200, Flea, he's willing to pay $300, so 300 is greater than 200, so he demands one quantity, and Anthony demands one quantity. 250 is higher than the 200, so he demands it too. Chad and John, they do not demand the good at the price of $200. They are not willing to pay as much. Their willingness to pay is lower. So the market quantities demanded in this example at the price of $200, it's 2. All right, so now let's come up with this information. Let's come up with a demand schedule. We've done demand schedules before. This one is going to look a little bit different. Here, rather than having single prices in the table, we're going to have price ranges. And what I want you to do is to figure out, similarly to the previous slide, I want you to figure out who's going to buy the good within each price range and how much is going to be the quantities demanded in the market. Again, press the pause button, write down the answers, and we're going to come back to discuss them. Okay, so at a price range between $301 and up, who buys the good? Nobody buys the good, right? Because the highest willingness to pay is from Flea. He's willing to pay as much as $300. 301, it's higher than that. So the quantities demanded are 0. Now between 251 and 300, then who's going to buy the good? Flea will, yes? Flea is willing to pay $300. The next in line with the highest willingness to pay would be Anthony at 250. He would not pay 251. So in this price range of 251 and 300, Flea is the only one who demands the good, and the quantities demanded in the market, it's 1. In a price range between 176 and 250, who buys the good? Flea continues to buy it at any price range here. He values the good at a higher amount than any of those prices within that range. Now Anthony, it's willing to buy the good as well. Anthony would be willing to pay 250, so anything between 176 and 250 he would buy. The next person in line would be Chad. He's willing to pay 175 but not 176. So Anthony and Flea are the two that are going to buy the good, and the market quantities demanded are, well, 2 units. Now we would say that Anthony, we would call Anthony in this case, he is the marginal buyer. So he's the buyer who would enter the market, who would buy that second unit, the additional unit, okay, at that price range. He is the marginal buyer in this price range. Similarly, for the price range between 126 and 175, now Chad is the marginal buyer. He would be willing to pay any price within this range of 126 and 175. The next is in line, it's John. He would pay 125 but not 126. And then at the price range between 0 and 125, they all buy an iPad. So the quantities demanded in the market are 4. Now John is the marginal buyer. He is the buyer that gets added to this demand when the price drops to any point within this price range. So with this demand schedule that we have moved along from the previous slide to this one, we can sketch the demand curve, yes? Now this demand curve is going to look different than the ones that we've seen before because the way that we're just constructing it, but just follow along, okay? So when the price range between 301 and higher, the quantities demanded, how much they are? They are 0. The price must drop to 300 in order to have that first quantity demanded. That would be from Flea. Any price range between 251 and 300, the quantities demanded, they remain at 1 unit. If the price drops to 250, then the second unit gets demanded. Anywhere between 176 and 250, the quantities demanded remain on 2. When the price drops to 175, we get the third quantity demanded, or the third unit, I should be saying, the third iPod being demanded. Any price range between 126 and 175, we stay at 3. Then the fourth iPod get demanded when the price drops to 125. And then any price range between 0 and 125, we would have 4 iPods demanded. So we see this is a demand schedule. It's the same idea as we have been talking about before. It's just that since we have only 4 consumers, then the demand schedule is going to look like this weird way in a staircase shape. Now, if we had a huge number of buyers, then you can imagine that in a competitive market, then there would be a large number of very tiny steps, many tiny steps here, right? And then it would look more like a curve as you're used to looking at. So this goes without any loss of generality. Okay, so here's an important observation to note from this demand schedule. At any Q, the height of the demand curve is going to be the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer. Okay, so at each Q, at any Q, the height of the demand curve is going to be the willingness to pay of the buyer. So for example, suppose at a quantity of 1, yes, at a quantity of 1, this is the willingness to pay of Flea. Flea was willing to pay $300 and that make him act and demand the good. So this first step, top step in the staircase, the height of the demand curve for a quantity of 1, that is the willingness to pay of Flea. Then the second step, that's the willingness to pay of the second buyer, right? So when the price drops to 250, that makes Anthony to act and buy the good. So he demands the second unit. Again, we say that he is the marginal buyer. And then Chad's willingness to pay. So for the third unit, the willingness to pay of that third unit is $175. And then for the fourth unit, the willingness to pay for that fourth unit is $125. So again, the important point here is, and this is very, very, very important, so that later on the following chapters, when we're looking at the demand curve and we are using that demand curve to refer to it as a value curve, yes, each point along that demand curve shows us the willingness to pay of each unit, the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer. So we're also going to say that is the willingness to pay of the marginal unit, right? So again, the first unit, the marginal benefit of the second unit, or the marginal value of the third unit, so on and so forth. All right, so now let's look at it at a smooth linear demand curve as you are used to looking at. So again, this is without loss of generality, right? So you can imagine that there are many steps like so here. All right, there are many steps like so, and we don't see it because there are so many buyers in this market, right? Imagine it that way. Now at a quantity of 5, so when Q is equal to 5, the marginal buyer is willing to pay $50 for a pair of shoes, right? So again, that is at a Q of 5, the height of the demand curve, it's 50. We say that that is the value of the fifth unit, or the marginal value of the fifth unit. Remember that different units have different values, yes, because there are different willingness to pay, as we saw from the previous example, okay? Let's say that at a quantity of 10, then what? Then for Q equal 10, the willingness to pay, that is the height of the demand curve, that shows us the willingness to pay for the 10th unit. So remember that when the price drops to $40, then that makes a marginal buyer act and buy a pair of shoes, right? So at a price higher than the $40, there was someone who was not willing to pay, say the $41, but then, or let's say this individual who was willing to pay 40 for the 10th unit, he was not willing, or she was not willing to pay 41. But when the price drops to 40, that makes the individual to act and purchase that 10th pair of shoes. So every point along the demand curve shows us the value of the marginal unit. Different units, they have different values. So now let's go back to this idea of consumer surplus. We define it as willingness to pay minus the price that the buyer actually pays. So let's suppose that the price in the market is $260. So if the price is $260, what is going to be the consumer surplus? What is going to be the gain from trade, from the market participants, from consumers? We haven't gotten to producers yet. What is going to be the gain from trade to consumers? Well, with a price of $260, then Flea is the only one who's willing to buy the good, yes? Because his willingness to pay is higher than the market price of $260. Anthony is not willing to pay $260. He's only willing to pay $250. So there's only one iPod that gets bought in the market, and it's bought by Flea. And his consumer surplus is his willingness to pay of $300 minus the market price of $260. That produces a gain of $40. So Flea, he's better off by $40. He's doing better by $40 than what he was actually willing to pay. And of course, since the others do not buy the iPod, then the consumer surplus from the other market participants is 0, and the total consumer surplus at a price of $260, it's $40. Now let's look at this graphically. That consumer surplus that we calculated of $40, geometrically it's the area of this green rectangle right here, okay? So we have the willingness to pay, that's the height of the demand curve for the first unit, that is the $300 of flea, minus the market price of 260, that is the height of this rectangle. And the area of a rectangle is the height times the base. So we have a height of $40 times the base of 1. Well, the size of this rectangle is $40. And since the other consumers do not buy the good because the market price is higher than their willingness to pay, they do not get any consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is $40 and is given by the area of that rectangle. Now let's suppose that the price is $220 instead. So now it's a lower price. So look at what happened to that consumer surplus from flea. So the willingness to pay from flea is exactly the same as $300. However, now he's paying $220, so it's a lower price. We all like paying lower prices, so with a lower price, he should be better off. And see what happens to his consumer surplus. So applying the formula 300 minus 220, that produces a consumer surplus of $80. Geometrically, that's the area of this rectangle. So that's an additional consumer surplus that it increases because the price dropped. But because the price dropped to 220, then what's going to happen? Now there's another person, Anthony, who's willing to pay more than the actual price of 220. Now he goes ahead and buys the good. Now there's going to be a consumer surplus for Anthony, $250. That's his willingness to pay and is the height of the demand curve for the second unit that gets demanded, minus the price of 220, that gives us a consumer surplus for Anthony of $30. Therefore, the total consumer surplus at the price of $220 is the 80 plus the 30, that gets us a consumer surplus of $110. And very important is to keep in mind the lesson, the geometric lesson here, yes? So what we have here is that the area under the demand curve and between the demand curve and the market price, and from 0 to Q, all that area right here, that's going to be our consumer surplus. Okay, now let's apply this concept to the typical smooth linear demand curve that we're used to working with and that we actually gonna continue working with. So let's suppose that the price of shoes is $30. So remember that different quantities have different willingness to pay, have different values to different consumers. So for the fifth unit that gets demanded, the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer, we already established that it was $50. That is the height of the demand curve at Q equal 5. But with a price of $30, then how much is consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus is going to be $20, right? We apply the formula willingness to pay minus the price, so that's 50 minus 30, that gets us a consumer surplus of $20 for that fifth unit, right? It's important to know that that is for the fifth unit. We could calculate that for different units as well. So that's for the fifth unit. It is this distance right here. But for the first unit, the distance between the demand curve and the price, that's going to produce some consumer surplus for the first unit, and some consumer surplus for the second unit, and some consumer surplus for the third, for the fourth, for the fifth, so on and so forth. All those units that go from 0 to Q, the output at the price of $30, there's going to be some distances between the demand curve and the market price. Calculate all of those distances, pretty much what we're doing is we are calculating the area of this triangle, right? So before we said that the area between the demand curve to the market price from 0 to the total level of output, that is a consumer surplus. In our previous example, it was the sum of many rectangles. Here is the area of a triangle, and we know what is the area of a triangle. The area of a triangle is the height times the base divided by 2. So we can calculate it here. The height is 60 minus 30 times a base of 15 units, right? So that's 15 minus 0. That's 15 units. So 1/2 times 15 times 30, that's 225. that is the total consumer surplus of all the market participants here. So different units have different consumer surpluses, but the sum of all those consumer surpluses is $225. All right, so now let's see what happens when the prices go up. So let's say that the price goes up from $30, say, to $40. Well, you can see that the consumer surplus is going to get smaller just by looking at this graph without doing any calculation at all, right? So this triangle right here at a price of 30 gets smaller. It's now going to be this smaller amount. And we can calculate this amount and know what's going to be the new consumer surplus. And actually, if we calculate this amount right here, this trapezoid right here, then the area of that trapezoid is going to be the loss of consumer surplus due to that increase in prices. So the new consumer surplus is going to be 100, so it got reduced. And we can split that loss right here. We can split it in two. There are two reasons why this consumer surplus falls. Number one, there's a fall in consumer surplus due to buyers leaving the market. As the price goes up, the law of demand says that the quantities demanded, they fall. And all of that pre-existing consumer surplus just goes away because those individuals are not buying the good anymore. So that's one reason why consumer surplus falls. Then there's a second reason why consumer surplus falls, and it's given by this rectangle, this green rectangle right here. So these individuals, they are still willing to pay the $4 or more. So they are continue to buy the good, and there's going to be a demand of 10 shoes with a market price of $40. But compared to the market price of $30, this green area right here, it's a loss for them. So they continue to buy those 10 units, but now they are paying a higher price. Therefore, their consumer surplus falls due to paying higher prices. Okay, now is your time to shine. Please press the pause button and answer these questions, and then come back to compare the answers. Okay, so for Q equal 10, to find the willingness to pay, we just trace out going from Q equal to 10 to the height of the demand curve. So going to the height of the demand curve, we see that that corresponds to a price of $30. So we say that that is the willingness to pay for the 10th unit. What is the consumer surplus there? So graphically, is the area between the demand curve and the market price. Typically, when we're looking at linear demand curve, it's going to be a triangle. So the area of this triangle is the height times the base divided by 2, and the area of that triangle, it's $50. Now let's suppose that the price falls to $20. Now what's going to happen? Graphically, you can easily see that that triangle that represents consumer surplus is going to get larger because now we have a lower price. And that has to be the case. With lower prices, the gain to consumers has to be higher. And we can see that that increase in the consumer surplus is due to two reasons. Number one, there's going to be an increase in the quantities demanded because according to the law of demand, falling prices, it causes higher quantities demanded. So those consumers, you can see here that from a price from 30 to a price of 20, quantities demanded go up from 10 to 20. So that's additional quantities that get demanded as a consequence of the fall of the price. So that's going to be a gain due to new consumers entering the market. And then those 10 units that were already bought before the price fall, now when the price falls, then since it's a lower price, those existing 10 units, now there is a higher consumer surplus for those existing ones. Yes. So for those two reasons, we will see consumer surplus to increase. So the area of this triangle, height times base, so 30 minus 20, that's 10. 20 minus 10, it's 10 divided by 2, that's the 50. And the area of this rectangle, it's height times base, height of 10, base of 10 is 100. Okay, so what have we learned here? Number one, we introduced the idea of willingness to pay, and it's our measurement of the value for each unit of a good. Different units have different values because different individuals, they value the good differently. Yes, and we even the same individual is going to value more units less. Yes, so that's the example that we've talked about before, that for the first glass of water we have a very high value, but for the second, third, fourth, so on and so forth, for higher glasses of water, once our thirst is quenched, then our value for subsequent glasses is lower. So for that reason, with a lower value of subsequent units, then there's going to be a lower maximum willingness to pay for subsequent units. Very important, and this should stick when we move on to other chapters. At any Q, the height of the demand curve is the marginal value of that amount of output Q. That is the willingness to pay, and that's our measure of value. And we also are going to refer to it as the value of the marginal unit. Consumer surplus is defined as the willingness to pay minus the price. This is our economic measurement of the gains to consumers. And we can measure this geometrically as the area between the market price and the demand curve from 0 to the quantity of output at the relevant price level. We saw that when prices fall, consumer surplus increases, and that's shown as a larger area between the demand curve and the market price line. And that increase in consumer surplus could be explained by two factors. Number one, an increase in consumer surplus to existing consumers that were already buying the good, but now they are paying a lower price, so that increases their consumer surplus. And number two, now with a lower price, there is an induced consumption, right? According to the law of demand, when prices fall, quantities demanded increase, and therefore there's going to be an additional consumer surplus as a consequence of that. So this is what we have learned so far. In our next video, we're going to talk about producer surplus.